Well, hello and welcome. We'll go ahead and get started. If I can ask folks to go ahead and mute themselves if they all aren't already. And we'll begin. Just want to say hello and thank you for joining the Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network information session titled Indigenous Food Security and Observing Arctic Change. My name is Krista Haringa, and on behalf of the Learning Network, I would like to welcome you today. I want to also acknowledge there's a team of folks, including Molly Tinkersley, Mike DeLu, Megan Dis, and Melinda Chase that are also working behind the scenes to bring this event to you today. The Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network is part of the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is one of 8 climate adaptation science centers around the country. And our goal for the Learning Network is to be a resource that helps support tribes as they work on climate adaptation across Alaska. We are based at the International Arctic Research Center, which is located on the UAF Trothyara campus within the traditional territory of the Lower Tanana Dene people. And I want to acknowledge the past, present, and future stewardship of the people from this land. And as we move into this presentation, I also want to encourage you to be mindful of the Indigenous lands you are on. For those who are on their ancestral homelands, consider how the land and the ocean has sustained your people for generations. For those who are visitors, consider the long history and the relationship its original stewards have with the land. These long-standing relationships are really central to what our speakers will be sharing with us today. And just a few logistics before we begin. Zoom takes a lot of bandwidth, so if you're having any trouble with your connection, we do have a toll-free option. And I'm just going to go ahead and put that in the chat real quick. So you can call in that way if you are having any trouble. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded, so you actually can view it at a later time from our website. And Megan, actually, if you could drop the link or Molly into the chat. And also if you want to view any previous sessions that we've hosted. If you can go to the next slide. And just for some background, given just the incredibly long-standing relationship Indigenous communities have had with the land and the fish, wildlife, plants, and birds that the land and ocean have supported, it's really highlights the incredible significance of food security and sovereignty to the overall health and well-being of Indigenous communities. And it also really underscores the value and importance of Indigenous knowledge systems in promoting responsible stewardship of natural resources. Indigenous knowledge and experience has often been ignored and left out of important policy and planning decisions that directly impact Indigenous communities. And the work of the Indigenous Food Security Working Group is really helping develop a process where Indigenous knowledge and experience can really help inform policy decisions. And so during today's session, we'll hear from 3 members of the Food Security Working Group who will provide background on the working group, also defining Indigenous food security and sovereignty, specifically how it relates to these observing activities, and really going into discussing some of the difficulties and opportunities with some of the work that they're doing. And if you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to include this graphic. Many of the sessions that we have hosted at the Learning Network have really focused on climate change adaptation at the community level. And I just want to highlight that the Food Security Working Group is working across a lot of these different scales, from the individual and community level, but also to pan-Arctic policy level. And so I think it's just, that's a very, it's very complex working between all of these different scales. And I think that they'll definitely highlight that complexity in their presentation. And next slide, please. And lastly, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have with us Craig Chythlook, who is a lifelong commercial salmon fisherman from Bristol Bay, Alaska, who also has 15 years of small business ownership and management experience. And Craig's work with the Food Security Working Group is really focused on building regional and community connections. Also with us is Margaret Rudolf, who is an interdisciplinary PhD candidate at UAF, and her family is originally from King Island. And she is doing a lot of work with the Food Security Working Group that's really focusing on some of the relationships and connections with science and research. And also with us is Victoria Chythlook Buschman, and she is Inupiaq from Utqiagvik, and she has lived and worked across the Arctic works to promote Indigenous peoples' involvement in conservation and management. And so we're very honored to have all three speakers with us today. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Margaret. I think you'll go ahead and start driving the slides. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Hi, Krista. Hi, everybody. On behalf of the Food Security Working Group liaison team, Margaret, Victoria, and myself, we're very happy and honored to be here, and thank you for organizing and asking us to present. I'm one of the three Indigenous liaisons for the Food Security Working Group, and our presentation is going to be a little bit about what we're doing and what we're working towards, mostly being coordinated effort to monitoring food security through an Indigenous lens. Next slide, please, Margaret. A little bit of background on the group. We grew out of the international event called the Arctic Observing Summit to become an informal network progressing Indigenous food security across the Arctic. One of our main focuses beyond observing and monitoring is to ensure that the Indigenous worldview kind of leads the way, taking a very holistic approach, focusing on human health and well-being. A major important part about our approach and how we interact with research is to ensure that the outcomes and goals of the project have some sort of actionable impact in the policy and resource management and decision-making bodies for the Indigenous communities, as opposed to like doing research and collecting data to collect data, but it is very focused on ensuring that the outcomes have an impact in the decision-making bodies. We're hoping to build up to be a coordinated effort and kind of engaging in all those different levels of participation that Krista highlighted earlier. Next slide, please. How we are talking about Indigenous food security, I think first and foremost, what's most important is the cultural aspect of what is Indigenous food security in the Arctic, is the right to eat nourishing and culturally relevant foods. Another important aspect, well, they're all important, but we're going to highlight this one a lot actually throughout this presentation, is that the information that is looked at and researched and created, or not created, but collected through our activities and the wonderful folks that are helping us out, is that they do have an impact to advocate Indigenous priorities in both management and policymaking forums. It's really, really, really important. We're consistently advocating for that in all of the spaces that we attend. And again, that we incorporate human health and well-being into every aspect of our observing system. I guess what that means is looking at food security as a part of a broader system. That food security isn't siloed and isolated, but it's a very holistic view that includes our Indigenous social, biological, ecological, cultural, and spiritual well-being. Doing our best to advocate to not put food security in its own little silo, but we take a very holistic approach when we're talking about food security and observations in the Arctic. Next slide, please. The benefits about this type of strategy and this research project in particular is that the liaison team and the food security working group are very much advocating that this is a community-driven and a very bottom-up approach when we look at identifying themes and topics and looking at implementing strategies and methodologies. One of the major ones Margaret will talk about definitely a lot more here a little bit later on is the co-production of knowledge with Indigenous communities and researchers. Just a brief summary is that it shifts some of the decision-making power towards the Indigenous communities on equal terms with traditional Western research. Another major focus area and benefit from this approach is that we're really focused on equity and reciprocity, equity in our leadership and our decision-making powers, resource distribution, so that at any point in time when we can and when it's applicable, it makes sense to pay the folks that work with the food security working group for their time and contributions, that we're not asking people to participate in these spaces for free and give up their time and their knowledge. Equitable use of our Indigenous knowledge and our methodologies. It's really, really important to highlight in all of the spaces that we participate in that Indigenous knowledge isn't anecdotal, but it is on par and should be leading the way with this research project. And again, just kind of really focusing on this regional effort around Indigenous food security. Next slide, please. The project that the liaison team is funded by, this research networking activity for sustained coordinated observation for Arctic change, is the mouthful. What this specific project that is funding the liaison team, a lot of the activities that we're participating in, what it is right now, it's a regional initiative in the Bering Sea area. We're focused on food security and food sovereignty. The research network activity is funding the liaison team, Margaret, Victoria, and myself, and is a part of a broader goals and activities from the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Roads project or process that is also funding an advisor and expert panel, which is an Indigenous-led group that are kind of making decisions about topics and themes and methodologies that the food security and the RNA participate in. They help fund the team that helps support and works alongside the food security working group. And it allows us as Indigenous liaisons and other Indigenous leaders and scholars to participate in these international spaces like the Arctic Observing Summit and other workshops and network activities where we get an opportunity to advocate. Sorry, my son's in the background. Advocate for our Indigenous worldview and our Indigenous perspective and how a project like this should be led. And ultimately kind of the Indigenous worldview and perspective leading the way for the SAON goals, developing and coming up with ideas for a shared Arctic theme or variable, which is really just a topic. Next slide, please. Thank you, Krista, again, for that wonderful introduction. Margaret, Victoria, and myself are the tri-liaison leadership team for the Food Security Working Group. As it was already mentioned, we have there's a lot of overlap, but there's definitely specifics that we are focused on. Margaret, as mentioned, is really looking at the science and technical aspect. Victoria is very involved with international engagement, and my focus area is community engagement. Next slide, please. Here's a little bit about our, who we are, what we hope to do, a little bit about our structure. The food security working group, the informal network that we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, or mentioned a little bit earlier on, is the heart of the project. And this community-driven bottom-up approach and the indigenous worldview is the core or the center of everything that we do. And the liaison team is working with the research folks, the RNA Cubes, UAF, and the International Arctic Research Center to help support everything and the topics and the inputs that we are receiving from the community. We have some focus areas that we're calling sub-working groups, where we have folks who are really interested in policy and management, outreach and education, the research side of things, international spaces like the Arctic Observing Summit. Most of us are really focused on sovereignty when it comes to our food security and our traditional resources. And then we're looking to put together an indigenous-led steering committee to really lay the foundation for our goals and what actions to take in setting our mission and vision in place. Next slide, please. Where we're at right now is we are really a case study. We're looking at being and becoming a coordinated effort on food security, focusing on climate sustainability, resilience, and resource management. And a lot of the topics and discussions that we are and already have had around these resources about salmon, halibut, crab, and bycatch, caribou. And I don't know about most importantly, but a big focus is on sovereignty, is the right to have our indigenous knowledge recognized in all spaces, and that our knowledge and our input and our expertise needs to be included in decision-making bodies. So that's a major focus, and one thing that the liaison team is consistently advocating for is indigenous knowledge and our ability to impact decision-making bodies. And I believe that is my last slide. Next slide, please. Yes, so thank you very much, and Margaret's going to take over from here.
Yeah, thanks. So I think one thing to acknowledge, we were the Food Security Working Group. That's a name we kind of inherited from the Arctic Observing Summit. But a lot of our discussions revolved around sovereignty, and it really, thinking about how we want to represent ourselves, not in the context of the Arctic Observing Summit, but ourselves as like an independent group. Food Sovereignty Working Group sounds a lot more in line with that. And so we are kind of going through a name change in the process. So I think we accidentally will use them interchangeably. So it is probably confusing being introduced this idea. It's the same group. And so I am Margaret. I am a PhD candidate. I'm studying co-production of knowledge, which is a big fancy buzzword, but really it means partnership. And researchers partnering with communities in a very equitable way, and they have decision-making process over every step of the research project. In the Food Sovereignty Working Group case, we're really interested in like the sovereignty aspect, and so probably it looks a bit more as really partnering with tribes, regional governance, different types of things, fish commissions, things like that. Those are the people we're interested in partnering with, understanding what they are already doing and how we could support that. One of our initiatives currently is with Arctic Observing and how we use to support that. And there's another aspect from also the more of the sciencey literature called boundary spanners. And that is something one of the things I'm actually studying are the people that span the boundaries between communities and research institutes. So the three liaisons is a perfect example. There's a picture here on this slide that has like a bunch of different examples that I've used before of the different types of people who are boundary spanners. Is very similar to the term two-eyed seeing, which is from Canada, where you see one eye with science and the other eye with indigenous, and you combine it. And so I'm really kind of curious what this looks like in Alaska, and how that's kind of what we're using in this. And so what does boundary spanners do is they really facilitate the dialogue between scientists, policymakers, tribal leadership, indigenous organizations, scientists, all those different aspects. That's kind of the representative in the picture on the right. This is kind of an example for Arctic observing, where we're all coming together and talking about what should be studied. And the buzzword for that, sorry, is shared Arctic variables. I think this is the continued frustration with academia, is trying to turn buzzwords into everything. And it is just, yeah, coming together and like making sure the process is a good one, that it's inclusive to community members, that they're actually getting heard, is something that's really important to us. And then I'm gonna go to the next slide for those following along. Oh, went too far. And kind of one way the process to approach this, I see as a Venn diagram, where you have one side science. And I think this is something to acknowledge, is that science has scientific knowledge, they have scientific methodologies. Generally, research is to create generalizable knowledge. So writing papers, how it applies to the broader sense. And then individual researchers, the reasons why they do research is for academic promotion. So writing papers, getting grants, teaching, all those different things lead to a researcher succeeding in academia. And that can be a conflict when you're working with communities, because communities have indigenous knowledge, they have indigenous methodologies, and all these are equivalent to science. They're doing the reasons to participate is for community benefit, and they want to lead a project based on their indigenous values. And so there's this tension, and then the center you have co-production knowledge, and you really need to negotiate a lot of different aspects to ensure that it is an equitable, ethical process. There's a paper out of Canada, Willie Ermine's Ethical Space of Engagement, which I think really explains this really well. He isn't talking about research, he's talking about the Canadian legal system, but I just thought he captured it really well. And he talks about really needing to question the rules of engagement and the status quo and everything. And it is, I think, stepping back and just kind of pushing that forward and thinking, making sure that we're not just doing research how researchers normally do, but really kind of questioning, how do we make this so it actually benefits community? How is it going to be useful for them? How is it, how are we going to make sure it's going to be ethical? Are we going to build capacity in the community to do their own research? Are we supporting indigenous sovereignty? All those different elements is something I'm really focusing on doing with this group in Arctic observing and thinking about that. But I also wanted to acknowledge, so I shifted to the next slide. Let me remember to tell it for people following along, that the Venn diagram, I had two equal circles, but there's a huge imbalance of power, particularly with science. Co-production of knowledge is a scientific framework. There's limitations in it being able to really represent the indigenous worldview. Because of that, it is really focusing on how we blend scientific and indigenous knowledges together to come up something that's useful. So it's very, it has its place, such as maybe Arctic observing, but it's not, you have to really be conscious of the decision whether using co-production knowledge or maybe indigenous methodologies might be a better choice in some situations. So being very kind of intentional in what you're doing. But also science, the reason why there's so much imbalance of power is science is also an industry. The grant funding, how grants are evaluated, how projects are considered successful, the resources institutes have over communities, it really supports feeding more power into institutes. And that makes a very limited benefit to communities because of that reason. And that's something to really be conscious of. There's also education system, how scientists are trained is not really supportive of alternative ways of knowing or necessarily doing this work, doing co-production of knowledge. It's difficult, the 10-year process to get academic promotion, to succeed in academia really doesn't support this community work, and it's something to consider. Co-production knowledge is a kind of a growing field, and that's why I study it, because I think it's really interesting and how it is changing academia. But there is very few examples of doing co-production knowledge in indigenous context. I did want to highlight a paper that is in preprint now. It should be coming out shortly. Xiamyo, I think I'm not Yupik, so I'm sorry if I pronounce that wrong. And it really kind of describes that process. What does that methodology look like when working with communities? It's very focused on equity, building capacity, indigenization, those aspects of pulling in Indigenous values, being intentional, kind of all these different elements, supporting Indigenous sovereignty, decolonization, all of those things. And so I like to highlight that as like a good example of this. And that's really kind of what I'm interested in and kind of what I'm trying to lead in the food sovereignty working group in our work. And so with that, I will hand it off to Victoria. I switched to the next slide.
Thanks, Margaret. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Victoria. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the International Arctic Research Center, but I actually sit at the Greenland Institute of Natural Resources, where I live here in Nuuk. That's the capital of Greenland. So it's actually afternoon for me, evening. I am a conservation biologist, and I got into this work because living a lifetime in a community where, you know, even what you put on the table is dictated by somebody else, by different policies and laws. I wanted to figure out how to do conservation better. So I got very involved in different management and conservation initiatives, particularly at the international level, particularly because I no longer live in Alaska. But we're going to talk a little bit about why this is important. So depending on where you live and what kind of subsistence you might be involved in, or what kind of community you live in, where perhaps residents of your community are involved in subsistence in one form or another, it's entirely possible that, you know, the laws and policies that are put in place about what you can feed your family are actually being made, if not, you know, just influenced at the international level. So it's really important for us to focus, of course, on our local community context, because this is where we are most greatly impacted. But of course, food security reaches across all of these different scales. It's local, it's regional, it's national, but we can't forget that a lot of these decisions are made first at the international level. So this is in many different formats. This is research that is happening all across the circumpolar Arctic. This is geopolitical advising about, you know, different economic and business opportunities in the Arctic, opening up shipping ways, which has actually implications for food security. If we think about, you know, ships coming through new waters where species haven't been interacting with these kinds of commercial ships before, and you know, there's no laws at the international level in the Arctic for, you know, what happens if you encounter wildlife and you hit wildlife with your ship because you're in a rush to go somewhere. There's also policy making at the international level. This includes, you know, notable organizations like the Arctic Council, who are influencing a lot of national policies and agreements. And then, of course, just general decision making about all matter of life that is related to food security. This might be wildlife management. This might be, you know, it's food security is related to so many different areas of society. It's really hard to define it as one particular thing. But all four of these things are affecting food security at the international level. Now I'm going to go through a little bit of a list and some other stuff and some other slides, but in general, we should recognize that a lot of international organizations don't know how to interact with Indigenous communities. And this is, you know, not for a lack of, you know, capacity on their side. It's more of a lack of knowing how to do it and a lack of desire to do it. But there is actually a bigger push now for what Margaret was talking about, specifically the co-production of knowledge and the use of Indigenous knowledge, especially climate change adaptation right now in international bodies, because it's been pushed by like the United Nations and the Arctic Council. So there is a growing interest in how we contribute to these international bodies. And that's good for us because we need to be involved in these conversations that are impacting our daily lives, even though, you know, we're not thinking about that every day. So we're just going to take, oh, Margaret, may you go to the next slide. So we're going to take just a quick look at this map, and I'm so sorry. It's so hard to get a circumpolar map where you can read all of the things on a small screen. But we're looking at a circumpolar map right now. This is sort of separated into the different, it's hard to say ethnographic regions, but there are many indigenous peoples in the Arctic, right? So the Food Security Working Group really grew out of an Alaskan kind of centered initiative. But it's also really good to recognize that there are other indigenous peoples all over the Arctic that are experiencing the exact same things as we are, even though they're in completely different governance and political contexts. So for example, in Alaska, we're dealing a lot with salmon issues, right? Well, the Sami in Northern Europe are also dealing with a lot of salmon issues, and they've been going through the same processes as we have for many years now. Along with that, we have, of course, in Alaska, we have some reindeer herders. There are some sheep herders here in Greenland. There are also reindeer herders in Northern Europe and all across Russia. All of us are also experiencing very similar issues around indigenous husbandry of animals. And these are interesting conversations to be had, and they're beginning to be had. But the reason that sort of this cross-circumpolar discussion about food security is important is because while we're experiencing many of the same impacts, there's a lot to learn from each other about how we have learned to deal with these within our particular political context, how we organize around food security, how we ensure that our governments are listening to our priorities and needs within these processes. So it's really important to recognize that, we're not alone in a lot of these discussions. And right now, the Food Security Working Group is still primarily very Alaska-centered, but we're expanding into other spaces in recognition that there's a lot of good discussion to have here, and there's a lot of good organizing. And if we're going to be doing organizing at the international level, then we should probably be partnering with other indigenous peoples to ensure that anything we put forward is really reflective of the circumpolar region in general. Margaret, can you go to the next one, please? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about these particular international organizations more specifically, because I think the examples are helpful. So there's 3 different kinds of international organizations and bodies that are really influencing and impacting food security. Now, it's important to note that almost none of these organizations remotely talk about food security by the definition of food security. Like, that's not on their agenda by any means. But all of these bodies are talking about, wildlife management, protected area management, these kinds of issues that are at the heart of food security. So some of these are the policy advising bodies. So these aren't ones that are actually making decisions for us, but to an extent, their research that they do, they bring together researchers from all over the world to tackle issues of, depletion of salmon or, migratory birds and these kinds of things. These documents that they put together, this research that they do is really influential over our national governments. So a lot of Arctic research that's happening out there that involves, our homelands and our species is being very influenced by outside research. Of course, there are the permanent participants, there are indigenous organizations that are involved in almost all of these bodies, but it's also important for us to recognize that we do need to be at that table because these discussions are very important to our well-being, right? So in the Arctic Council, this would be CAF. I'm sorry, there's so many acronyms, but all of these titles are so long they wouldn't all fit on the slide. CAF is the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, which is one of the 6 working groups of the Arctic Council, and they're responsible for wildlife conservation and vegetation conservation in the Arctic. So this has, not just issues for wildlife of particular interest like polar bears and caribou and migratory birds that we all rely on, but of course also vegetation. So what are we collecting? What kinds of vegetation is rare? And then there's PAIM, which is the protection of Arctic marine environments. So they do a lot of work in the Arctic marine ecosystems, and they're making a lot of they do a lot of research on like contaminants in the Arctic. So what is in our food, those kinds of things. And we need to be involved in these processes for sure, because they're telling us, you know, they're giving the advice to our countries and other researchers about what needs to be done. Then we have these intergovernmental organizations, specifically the United Nations and all of the different bodies of the United Nations, because the United Nations is this big amorphous thing. There are a few that are particularly important to food security. The first is the UNFCCC, which is essentially the Climate Change Secretariat of the United Nations. They do increasingly more work with Indigenous knowledge, particularly Indigenous knowledge in the context of climate change. Food security discussions have never happened, but they have pulled together many Indigenous knowledge holders to be a part of their proceedings, to give advice to the UNFCCC about their processes and their priorities and directives. So that's good. The second is UNESCO. I don't even remember what this one is, but it's essentially like what the title is. But UNESCO is the World Heritage Sites all across the world. We don't have so many in the United States, but in other countries, the UNESCO World Sites are sites of particular importance. And there are some all across Indigenous homelands here in the Arctic. And UNESCO has a very particular set of, well, what can you do in a protected area? Like, what are you allowed to do when a space is protected? And this historically has been an issue for food security because they've limited the ability to go to protected areas and to subsist in protected areas. But now there's emerging mechanisms to have protected areas that, you know, are only inhibiting, for example, mineral extraction, and hunting and fishing is totally allowed. So there's also a need to be involved in this. Then there's the BBNJ. This is biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which is one of the biggest discussions right now in the United Nations. This essentially says, who gets to say what happens to wildlife when they're no longer in our country? And this means a lot when it comes to the Arctic Ocean, because once they pass beyond our national jurisdiction in Alaska, and because most of our wildlife, particularly in the Arctic, are migratory, I'm thinking birds, polar bears, walruses, whales, you know, they're actually not under our law anymore once they pass out of Alaska's national borders. So the discussion in the United Nations right now is who gets to say what happens and what are going to be the laws and what are the penalties for being, what should I say? What are the penalties for example, hitting an endangered species with a ship because you're too quick to go somewhere? The last one is the CBD. This is the Convention on Biological Diversity. And this is the discussion that has a lot to do with, well, global conservation of different species of interest. And many of these species of interest in the Arctic are the species that we rely on, different migratory birds, endangered marine mammals, that we have hunted and fished sustainably for thousands of years. So we definitely need to be involved in that as well. And the last one that I'm going to discuss is there are, of course, intergovernmental organizations that have extremely specific functions, and they come out of specific treaties. And the two in Alaska that are most well known are the International Whaling Commission and the US-Russia Polar Bear Commission. And the reason that I bring these up is because there are organizations out there who are directly involved actually in setting international quotas for the species that we subsist on. And of course, we send people to these organizations as well. But we need to be more involved so that our knowledge is being included in some of these discussions, that we can continue to demonstrate that our knowledge is very valuable, and that we have a place at these tables. And so I just wanted to bring some of these up to the table in case any of you had interests in, you know, following some of these threads wherever they might go. They are important organizations and discussions, and they're very important for us, you know, especially if you're living in a subsistence community or live a subsistence lifestyle. I'm going to leave it with that and give it back, I think, to Craig. But thanks very much.
Yeah, next slide, please. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, a little bit about what the food security, food sovereignty working group is doing. I won't take up any more time. I think we covered all the topics very well and leave the last bit of time here for discussion and conversation with all of you. So thank you very much for your time and attendance and participation today.
Well, thank you, Craig and Margaret and Victoria for that presentation and also just walking through some of the different components of your work. I guess I'd like to open it up to participants, either via the chat or if you would like to unmute yourself and go ahead and if you have any questions or comments for any of our speakers today. And maybe as folks are gathering their thoughts, actually, do we have anyone on the phone who has a question or comment for any of our speakers?
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, this is Michael Peter. I'm calling from Yukon, the Gucci Tribal Government, Second Chief. Yeah, there's a big need. Just a comment here. But yeah, I think we do need to be at the table because I know we're one of the most regulated tribe in the nation as far as for hunting and fishing, you know, and then also too that I do sit on the climate change task force with TCC, and then also I did notice the last few years the migratory birds, the waterfowl, it's changing within the last few years. I noticed quite a bit. Seems like they're leaving a lot sooner and they're coming a lot later, or they're kind of seem like they're kind of confused. And I think they kind of changed their route also too, their migratory route from Canada into Alaska. But other than that, I just like to say, yeah, I mean, that's I'm glad we got called to go because there is a big need for food security, you know, and we have people that are making decisions that don't even live in the village or that are even in Alaska sometimes, you know, more or less, you know, even our own government. But I think we do need to have somebody that does represent our rural people, our indigenous people in all the villages. Thank you.
Yes, hello, my name is Hazel Nelson and I work for the Chythlook Intertribal Coalition. And I've been listening today and really appreciate how the presenters spoke to progress in the process of co-production and how we're able to incorporate more of our Indigenous knowledge into the technical papers that are coming out. For me, it's really helpful to learn how to work and co-produce papers. And I think that listening to presenters today has been very helpful for me, and it gives me hope that we are making real progress in recording life on our terms and how we are addressing our struggles with climate change and how we are building resilience for our tribes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for both of those comments. And just if any of the speakers want to go ahead and respond, please do. I did want to just acknowledge the question in the chat. Are there plans to share the reporting with the broader scientific community? We do record these sessions and have them available on our Alaska Tribal Climate Resilience Learning Network website. And part of the reason we like to do this is because these presentations and conversations can definitely be a helpful resource moving forward. And so on that end, yeah, it's most certainly available for viewing at a future time. And I see Ryan Tui's hand is raised. Go ahead, Ryan.
Hey, everyone, and thanks, Victoria, Craig, and Margaret for the talk today. It was really great. I was wondering if any of you would be willing to share kind of like an example or examples of places where you thought kind of individuals or communities, like there was a really good process to involve individuals or communities in some of the work that you're doing, if you had any kind of examples just off the top of your head.
I can go really fast. So I live here in Greenland, and I work in one of the protected areas. As part of my job, it's called Aseviposa. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This site was protected because the community of Sisimiut decided that they were looking for conservation options that didn't limit their ability to hunt and fish, but because they were concerned about potential mining activity in the area, they opted to work with UNESCO to put together a new protected area. This has been super successful, and they've been really involved in all of the research, all of the kind of cultural heritage aspects of the protected area. It was very community driven from the beginning. And a lot of it was about food security. The word food security was, of course, never used because Greenlanders are Greenlandic and Danish speaking, but it very much had to do with wanting to protect the area for, the right to hunt and fish so that families could continue to live off the land. And so there were many consultations, and there were, of course, researchers brought in from other parts of the world to kind of do some of the more technical aspects of the nomination. But there's a lot of material out there on Aseviposa about that process, how people were involved. That's not a very Alaska-centered example, but it's out there.
I think for Alaska, a good example is the Indigenous Peoples Network. Lauren Devine is part of our group, and we're definitely leaning on her in some of these areas and her great expertise on this. And so she's not Indigenous, but she works for this Aleut community of St. Paul. She has a PhD, I forget in what, biology of some sort. But yeah, it's really focused on advocating for the community in marine issues. It is looking at community-based monitoring as well as pulling in Indigenous knowledge and observations along those sorts. So I think she's a great example. There's a link I posted, and Craig reposted it in the chat.
Thank you for those examples, and apologies, you may hear a background noise of my son. I wanted to, we have a question from Evelyn. How can we support the speaker's efforts, and what is next for the group?
I think kind of one aspect is presenting on this. We are just starting out. I don't know if that really made it clear. And so just a lot of background work in developing our mission, our values, our process. And so it is, I think I'm very glad that it resonated with people, because it feels like we're on the right track then to get that feedback. And if you're interested, it is a growing network of people, the Food Sovereignty Working Group. And so I think if you reach out back through probably Krista or whoever emailed you, we could probably get you signed up for our Google group. And as we start figuring out our structure more and more, but we are basically just starting out. So
yeah, I think I could definitely add a little bit to that from my perspective. Because we are starting out, one thing that we are really looking forward to is building engagement with the community to ground our work. A lot of what's been done right now has been done in spaces outside of the community. And it's really, really important for us as we move forward to build our network and confirm and ground what we're doing from the Indigenous community, Indigenous leaders, so that we're representing our regional folks on an individual, community, and at every level. So I think if you're, how can we support is participating and continuing to advocate in each and every one of our own ways about our Indigenous food security and sovereignty. And like Margaret mentioned, yeah, if any of you are interested and if this resonates a lot with you, please feel free to reach out. I think moving forward, that's something that we're really, really looking forward to.
And on that note, Craig, could I invite you, Victoria and Margaret, to put your contact information in the chat, especially if folks are interested in reaching out to you directly with any follow-up questions, or just want to maybe learn a little bit more about how they might be able to join the food security or food sovereignty working group, or some of the other international bodies that, especially Victoria, that you highlighted. I do want to just highlight a comment. This was, so we're also on Facebook Live. A comment from Dots Sherwood. Thank you so much for this presentation, which has helped me understand food sovereignty in the Arctic better. I'm a One Health student, veterinarian, and interests come from intersection of human and animal and environmental health, and very much so learning as a settler in Alaska. So just yeah, definitely confirming that it's great to hear some of the work that you all are doing. Just want to pause for another moment just to see if there's any other comments or questions from the audience here. Well, seeing none, I do want to just thank all of you, Craig, Victoria, Margaret, for taking time out of your day to share with this audience. I do want to just let folks know we will have our next information session scheduled for March 16th. And that is going to be focused on wellness in climate change adaptation. Our guest speakers are going to be Laverne Dementieff, Shasta, and Nita DeWitt. And so more coming about on that with through our Alaska Tribal Resilience Learning Network listserv. I also want to let folks know just some upcoming events. Next week is the Alaska Forum on the Environment, and that's going to all be virtual next week. And also applications are open for the NICAL Native Youth Climate Adaptation Congress, and that's going to be held in June. So if you have any youth that you know that might be interested in this opportunity, it's a gathering of Indigenous youth across the US, and it's definitely a good learning and networking opportunity. We do actually have a presentation that we did last year I think in April, that gives a little bit more background on this opportunity. So if it's something, if you know of youth that might be interested, you can take a peek at that recording just to learn a little bit more about that. With that, I want to just thank you all for taking an hour out of your day to come join us. And I hope you have a great afternoon.